Shaq's phone buzzed again. Another message. Another warning. Unknown number. You should have left when you had the chance. His heart pounded as he gripped the steering wheel. Eyes locked on the darkened house. Langley was supposed to be gone. On vacation. But then who was standing in the upstairs window? And why had Shaq just received a picture of himself? The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Then from inside the house, thump, a sound. A shadow moved past the window. Shaq's blood ran cold. He wasn't alone. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Shaq stretched his arms as he stepped out onto his porch, the crisp morning air filling his lungs. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that made early walks his favorite part of the day. But just as he adjusted his hoodie and prepared to head down the driveway, something made him stop. His neighbor's house, Langley's place, stood across the street, its windows reflecting the soft golden light of the rising sun. Langley had left town a week ago, off to Europe for a month-long trip. The house was supposed to be empty, but someone was standing in the upstairs window. Shaq's breath hitched. The figure was tall, motionless, standing just behind the sheer curtains. He couldn't make out the features, but there was no doubt. Someone was there, watching. A cold shiver crawled up Shaq's spine. He squinted, trying to get a better look. Maybe it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. He blinked once. The figure was gone. Shaq's heart pounded in his chest. He took a step forward, staring at the window. Nothing moved. The curtains barely swayed. His mind raced through the possibilities. Was someone inside? Maybe a burglar? A squatter? Or was it just his imagination? He shook his head, chuckling under his breath. Man, I need to lay off those late-night horror movies. Turning away, he took a few steps down his driveway. But then, thump. The sound came from inside Langley's house. Shaq whipped his head around, eyes locking onto the front door. The sound wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like something heavy shifting inside. His muscles tensed. He waited, listening. Silence. Then, thump. Louder this time. Shaq swallowed hard, instinct screaming that something wasn't right. The house was empty. It had to be. But someone, or something, was inside. He pulled out his phone, hovering his thumb over Langley's contact. Should he call? What would he even say? Hey man, I think your house is haunted. That sounded ridiculous. Then another thought hit him. If someone was inside, they had to have gotten in somehow. The front door looked locked. No signs of forced entry. He glanced at the driveway. Langley's car wasn't there. It hadn't been for days. Shaq hesitated. Maybe it was just the house settling. Maybe there was some logical explanation. But his gut told him otherwise. And then, his phone vibrated in his hand. An unknown number. His pulse spiked. He stared at the screen, debating whether to answer. The call disconnected. A second later, thump. Shaq's stomach twisted. He wasn't imagining things. Someone was in that house. And whoever they weren't supposed to be there. The phone buzzed again. Another unknown call. This time, Shaq answered. A low, distorted voice whispered, "You shouldn't have seen that." Shaq's muscles tensed as he focused on Langley's house. The early morning air felt colder now, the quiet more unnatural. No wind, no birds, no distant hum of passing cars, just silence, a silence that felt wrong. Had he really seen someone in the window? Maybe it had been a trick of the light, a shadow from a tree swaying in the breeze. Maybe he was imagining things, but deep down, his gut knew better. He held his breath, waiting, scanning the second-floor window where the figure had stood. The curtains hung still, barely moving. Maybe whoever it was had stepped back into the darkness. Maybe... Boom! Shaq flinched as the blinds slammed shut. The sound cut through the morning stillness like a gunshot. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. Someone was definitely inside Langley's house. His first instinct was to call Langley, but what would that accomplish? He was thousands of miles away, enjoying a vacation. He couldn't exactly come running. The police? Maybe. But what would he even say? Hey, my neighbor's house is supposed to be empty, but I saw something move. It sounded weak. He needed more than just a feeling before he called the cops. Shaq narrowed his eyes at the house. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe it was just a squatter or a worker Langley forgot to mention. He took a slow, steadying breath, trying to convince himself it was nothing. Then, his phone buzzed in his hand. Shaq frowned, looking down. The caller ID read, "Unknown number." His stomach tightened. Coincidence? The phone vibrated insistently in his grip, the ringtone cutting through the silence. He hesitated. Then against his better judgment, he answered. For a moment there was nothing, just silence. Then, a voice, low, distorted, like a radio frequency just slightly off. "Turn around." Shaq's body froze. The voice was deep, mechanical, like it had been run through a filter. It was impossible to tell if it was a man or a woman, young or old. It was just hollow. His fingers clenched around the phone, his breathing shallow. Slowly, stiffly, as if his body were made of stone, he turned his head. At the end of his driveway, a hooded figure stood perfectly still. A wave of icy dread crawled up Shaq's spine. The figure was tall, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, its hands buried deep in the pockets. The street lamp behind it cast its face into complete darkness, watching him. Neither of them moved. Shaq's mind raced. Had this person been standing there this whole time? Had they been watching him from the moment he stepped outside? Then, in one slow, deliberate motion, the figure tilted its head to the side. The movement sent a fresh jolt of unease through Shaq. It wasn't natural. It was slow, calculated, like a predator observing prey. Shaq took a single step back, and then the figure sprinted toward him. Not a walk, not a jog, a full-on sprint. Shaq's adrenaline spiked. His instincts screamed at him to move, but for a split second he couldn't. His brain was still catching up to what was happening. Then his fight or flight kicked in. Shaq's pulse roared in his ears as his body finally reacted. His muscles tensed, his breath sharp. Run? Fight? He had seconds to decide, but the figure was already too close. Shaq's instincts kicked in before his brain could catch up. Run. His feet pounded against the pavement as he bolted toward his house, his breath sharp and ragged. He didn't have time to think. His body was moving on pure survival instinct. Behind him, the hooded figure gained speed. Shaq risked a glance back. The figure wasn't just running. It was sprinting, arms pumping, legs moving unnaturally fast like a trained athlete, or worse, like someone used to chasing people down. His stomach twisted. This wasn't random. This wasn't just some creep messing around. This was targeted. The porch light flickered on as Shaq reached the front steps. His fingers fumbled for the key in his pocket, sweat slicking his palms. He nearly dropped it. Another glance over his shoulder. The figure was closer. Too close. He could hear the heavy, deliberate thuds of its boots against the pavement, could feel the sheer force of its approach. Shaq's heart slammed against his ribs. Focus. He jammed the key into the lock, twisting it with desperate urgency. Click. The door swung open just as he turned to face his pursuer. Gone. His breath caught in his throat. The driveway was empty. The street, still. The shadows stretched long under the flickering street lamp, but the figure vanished. Shaq's pulse roared in his ears. His eyes scanned the area, left, right, behind the car, across the yard. Nothing. No footsteps, no rustling of bushes. It was like the figure had never been there. His brain refused to accept it. No one could move that fast. No one could just disappear. Shaq stepped onto his porch, one foot hovering over the threshold. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to get inside, lock the door, and don't look back. But his gut, his stubborn, ever-curious gut, told him to keep watching. Maybe the figure was hiding. Maybe it was still here. He narrowed his eyes, scanning every shadow, every possible hiding spot. Nothing. His phone buzzed. Shaq nearly jumped. He pulled it out, fingers trembling slightly as he looked at the screen. The same caller ID as before. Unknown number. His breath hitched. He hesitated. Answering the last call hadn't exactly worked in his favor. But if this was connected, if whoever was on the other end knew something, he couldn't ignore it. With a deep breath, he answered. Silence. A few seconds passed. Then, just like before, a voice. Distorted. Mechanical. You let it see you. Shaq's skin prickled. His grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? His voice came out steady, but his pulse was anything but. A low, crackling static filled the line, almost like breathing. Then, don't go back outside. Shaq's stomach twisted. His eyes darted to his front door, to the porch beyond it. His entire body was on high alert. His lips parted, but before he could say a word, click, the line went dead. The silence was deafening. Then, a sound from the porch. A single deliberate tap against the front step. Like a shoe hitting concrete. Something was out there. But this time Shaq wasn't sure if it was waiting for him or already inside. Shaq's grip tightened around his phone, his fingers pressing into the plastic case. The air in his house felt thick, like something unseen was wrapping around him, waiting. Then, the voice on the other end of the line returned, distorted, mechanical, and slow, like a bad radio transmission. You shouldn't have seen that. Shaq's stomach twisted. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. His pulse hammered against his throat, but his mind was already moving, already piecing things together. Seen what? The shadow in the window? The hooded figure that chased him? The empty house that wasn't supposed to be empty? His tongue felt heavy in his mouth, but before he could respond, the voice dropped another bombshell. "He's not on vacation." Shaq's breath hitched. His entire body went rigid. His neighbor, Mr. Langley. The same Mr. Langley who had sent him a casual text just before leaving town. The same Langley who had promised to be gone for a month. That wasn't possible. "You're lying," Shaq said, his voice low and cold, his knuckles white around the phone. But the call ended. The silence that followed was suffocating. Shaq pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at the blank screen. No number, no trace, no way to call back. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs as his thoughts raced. Langley wasn't on vacation? Then where was he? Shaq swiped to his messages, his fingers moving faster than his thoughts. He opened Langley's last text. "See you in a month, buddy. If you hear noises, it's just the house settling." His stomach twisted. Something about it felt off now. The wording, it was too careful, too scripted. It read like something someone wanted him to believe. A chill crawled up Shaq's spine. He needed proof. If Langley had really gone on vacation, there would be some record of it, right? A flight confirmation? A social media check-in? His hands felt clammy as he pulled up Google on his phone. Langley's name plus flight number. No results. His fingers moved faster. He searched for flights that had left the airport on the day Langley had supposedly departed. Nothing. His throat dried up. Shaq had always been good at spotting red flags, and right now, his instincts were screaming at him that something was very, very wrong. Langley never left, so who sent that text? His thumb hovered over Langley's contact. He had to call. He had to hear his voice. He tapped CALL. The phone rang once, twice, then straight to voicemail. Shaq's pulse hammered as the automated voice played. "The number you have dialed is unavailable. Please leave a..." He hung up. His chest rose and fell, his breath coming out in shallow bursts. Okay, maybe Langley's phone was off. Maybe he just forgot to check in. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding. But deep down, Shaq knew better. His eyes flicked toward the darkened house next door. The same house where he had seen something that shouldn't be there. His gut twisted, screaming at him to pay attention. Shaq had two choices. Ignore this, and pretend nothing happened. Find out what the hell was really going on. He glanced at his front door. It was still locked, his hands still trembling from earlier. But now, curiosity had won. He grabbed his car keys and his jacket, mind racing as he walked outside. The night air hit him like a cold slap to the face, but he barely noticed. His attention was locked onto Langley's house. It sat still, dark and silent. Too silent. He stepped off his porch, moving toward his driveway, debating whether to drive past the house for a closer look. Then, Shaq's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He froze. A text. One single sentence. "Stop looking or you'll be next." Shaq's breath caught in his throat. His fingers tightened around the phone so hard he thought it might shatter. His heartbeat roared in his ears. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't paranoia. Someone was watching him. Right now. Slowly. So slowly. Shaq lifted his head, and his blood ran cold. A figure stood down the street, barely visible under the glow of a flickering streetlight, dressed in dark clothes, hood pulled up, staring straight at him. Shaq's pulse spiked. The figure tilted its head, just like the one from before. Shaq's muscles tensed. Then, it moved. The figure took a single, slow step forward, then vanished into the darkness. Shaq's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he read the text message. His pulse pounded in his ears. The message wasn't just a threat, it was a warning, and the fact that it came from inside Langley's house sent a chill through his entire body. His eyes flicked back up to the house. The windows were dark, lifeless. There was no sign of movement, no shifting of curtains, no flicker of a shadow, just silence, the kind of silence that felt wrong. He checked the driveway again. Langley's car was still there, parked exactly where it had been a month ago. Dust had gathered along the windshield edges, but the tires looked untouched. No footprints in the dirt, no signs of recent activity. It didn't add up. Shaq's mind raced. If Langley had really gone on vacation, why was his car here? And if someone else was inside the house, who were they? His fingers hovered over his phone. He could call the cops, but what would he tell them? That he saw a shadow in the window? That someone sent him a creepy text? That wasn't enough. He needed more proof. Taking a deep breath, he eased his foot off the brake and slowly rolled his car forward. Watching the house as he passed, he scanned every inch, searching for movement. A flicker of light, a shifting shadow, anything. And then, there it was, a faint glow in the upstairs window. It was barely visible, just a sliver of warm light against the darkness. But it was there. Someone was inside. Shaq's stomach knotted. He reached for his phone, about to take a picture, but before he could, his screen flashed with another text. Unknown number. Leave. Now his breath caught in his throat. His thumbs hovered over the keyboard. He wanted to reply, to demand answers, but something told him he shouldn't. Instead, he gripped the wheel, forcing himself to stay calm. That's when he saw it. In his rearview mirror, the curtain on the second-floor window shifted. Someone was watching him. Not just watching, studying him. Shaq's fingers clenched around his phone. His instincts screamed at him to drive away, but his gut told him something bigger was happening here, something that didn't make sense. His foot hovered over the gas pedal, but before he could make a decision, his phone buzzed again. Another text. Unknown number. Last chance. Don't come back. Shaq exhaled slowly, his pulse racing. He had two options. Walk away now and pretend none of this ever happened, or find out the truth. And Shaquille O'Neal wasn't the kind of man to walk away. His eyes narrowed as he looked back at the house one last time. The light in the upstairs window had disappeared. The curtain had stopped moving, but the tension in the air remained. Something was wrong, and he was going to find out what. As Shaq starts to pull away, his headlights catch something in the distance. A dark figure standing at the tree line, watching him. Shaq's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he stared up at the second-floor window. His breath caught in his throat. There, staring directly at him, was a face. But it wasn't Langley. It wasn't the hooded figure from before. It was someone else. Someone completely unfamiliar. The man's features were eerily still, his pale face illuminated by the faint glow of a single light inside the house. His dark eyes were locked onto Shaq's, unblinking, watching, studying. There was something unnerving about how motionless he was, not shifting, not reacting, just staring. Shaq's pulse pounded in his ears. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to get as far away from this house as possible. But something about the figure, about the way he stood there, unwavering, held him in place. Then, without warning, the figure moved. Not a normal movement, not a step back or a turn away. It was instant. One moment, he was in the window. The next, gone. Shaq's stomach dropped. His hands scrambled for his phone. He needed proof. He had to capture whatever was happening in this house. If he could just snap one picture. Thump. A sound from inside the house. Shaq's fingers fumbled with his phone, the camera app opening as he focused on the now empty window. But before he could press the button, jerk! His passenger side door handle yanked violently. Shaq's entire body jolted. Someone was trying to get into his car. His head whipped around, heart slamming against his ribs. The street was empty. No one was there. But the door handle moved again, rattling aggressively as if someone on the other side was trying to rip it open. Shaq didn't wait. His foot slammed against the gas pedal. The tires screeched against the pavement as his car launched forward, speeding away from Langley's house. He didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. He didn't want to see if someone was still there, standing in the dark, watching him leave. His breath came in heavy, uneven gasps. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had been in intense situations before. Fights. High-pressure games. But this was different. This was something he didn't understand. His phone buzzed on the dashboard. Shaq swallowed hard. He already knew who it was. Unknown number. He hesitated before picking it up, glancing at the road to make sure he was still in control. With a slow, steadying breath, he opened the message. His stomach twisted. It was a photo of him, sitting in his car, taken from inside Langley's house. His head snapped up. He was miles away now, far from the house. But that photo, someone had taken it when he was parked outside. Someone had been inside the house the entire time. A chill crawled up Shaq's spine. His hands felt clammy as he gripped the phone tighter, staring at the image. The angle, the perspective. It was from the upstairs window, from the exact same spot where he had seen the man standing. His mind raced. If the man was the one who took the picture, then why had he disappeared? Shaq's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The streetlights blurred past him as he bed down the road, and then something made his blood run cold. At the far end of the road, standing beneath a flickering streetlight, a hooded figure, perfectly still, watching, waiting. Shaq's heart pounded as he turned onto a new road, but his phone buzzed again. Another message. This time just 3 words. You're too late. Shaq sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His eyes remained locked on the image on his phone, an image of himself, sitting in his car outside Langley's house, taken from inside. His heart pounded in his chest like a war drum. Someone was inside that house. Someone had been watching him. And now, whoever they were, they knew he had seen them. Shaq took a deep breath, forcing himself to think logically. He had two choices: drive away, pretend none of this ever happened, and hope it was just some strange misunderstanding, or go back and find out exactly what was happening. He already knew which choice he was going to make. He pulled into an empty parking lot a few blocks away, his mind racing. He needed backup, someone who could help him figure this out before he went any further. Maya. He quickly pulled up her contact and pressed call. It rang twice before her voice came through, sharp and alert. "Shaq? What's going on?" "Maya, I need you to look something up for me," he said, trying to steady his voice. "Langley's supposed to be out of town, right? Can you check if he's posted anything recently?" There was a pause on the other end. "That's actually weird. I just realized he hasn't posted anything since the day he left. No airport selfies, no vacation updates. That's not like him." Shaq's grip on his phone tightened. "What about his phone? Can you track it?" Maya hesitated. "Give me a second." The sound of furious typing came through the line. "Then okay, that's even weirder." Shaq's stomach twisted. "What?" "His phone," Maya said. "It's still active, and it never left the city." The air in Shaq's lungs turned ice cold. Langley never left, which meant someone had been lying from the start. Shaq clenched his jaw. "I'm going in." "Wait, what?" "No, Shaq, that's a terrible idea. I don't have time to sit around and wonder about this, Maya," he said. "Somebody's inside that house, and if it's not Langley, then something's really wrong." Maya sighed. "If you're dead set on doing this, at least be smart about it. Keep me on the line." "Got it." Shaq ended the call, took a deep breath, and climbed out of his car. He wasn't going through the front door. He wasn't that reckless. Instead, he took a long detour through the neighborhood, circling to the back of Langley's property. The backyard was dark and quiet, the wind rustling the overgrown grass. Shaq moved carefully, every step calculated. His eyes darted to the second-floor window, the same one where he'd seen the figure. Empty, but he wasn't fooled. As he reached the back of the house, he noticed something strange. The back door was slightly open. A chill ran down his spine. Whoever had been inside, they hadn't locked up behind them. Shaq paused, listening. The house was silent. No movement. No voices. He pushed the door open slowly. The hinges let out a faint creak, cutting through the stillness like a knife. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying a faint metallic scent that made Shaq's stomach churn. He stepped inside, his muscles tense, ready for anything. The house was dark, only the faint glow of streetlights outside illuminating the living room. Furniture was undisturbed, no signs of a struggle, but something still felt off. Shaq took another step forward, and then his foot hit something on the ground. A phone. Langley's phone. Shaq's pulse skyrocketed. He knelt down, picking it up. The screen was shattered, but when he pressed the power button, it lit up. One missed message from an unknown number. Shaq's fingers hovered over the screen. He swallowed hard before opening the message. "You shouldn't be here." Every nerve in his body screamed at him to turn around to get out of that house. But before he could move, thump, upstairs. Shaq froze. Then another sound. A creak. Someone was moving. He gritted his teeth, standing up slowly. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to breathe. He had come this far. He wasn't turning back now. Step by step, he moved toward the staircase. The dim light barely illuminated the hallway ahead. Shadows stretched across the walls like reaching hands. The air felt heavier with every step. He reached the base of the stairs and looked up. The hallway above was completely dark, but Shaq knew, without a doubt, someone was up there. He exhaled quietly, then began climbing. Each step creaked under his weight, but he kept his movements controlled. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, ready for anything. As he reached the top, a faint sound met his ears. Breathing. He wasn't alone. His eyes darted down the hallway. There were 3 doors, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, all of them slightly ajar. He took another step forward. Then a shadow moved. Fast. Too fast. Shaq barely had time to react before one of the doors slammed shut. His heart slammed against his ribs. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he took another step forward instead. He reached the door, the one that had just slammed shut. His hand hovered over the doorknob. The air was ice cold. Then, just as he started to turn it, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The sound made his pulse spike. He yanked it out and looked at the screen. Unknown number. Shaq hesitated, then answered. A low whisper came through the speaker. "You walked right into it." Shaq's breath caught in his throat. Behind him, the floor creaked. Someone was standing right there. Shaq's body tensed as he turned, heart hammering in his chest. The house was supposed to be empty, but someone else was here. The furniture around him told a silent story of chaos. Chairs were toppled over. A lamp lay shattered on the floor, and the coffee table had deep scratches, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. The air was thick with dust and something else, something metallic. Blood. Then he noticed the footprints, muddy, erratic, leading toward the basement door. A sinking feeling settled in his gut. He should turn around, leave, call the cops, but something pulled him forward. A sound, software faint, muffled. Someone was down there. Shaq took a cautious step toward the basement door. The wooden floor groaned beneath his weight. His pulse thundered in his ears. He reached for the doorknob, fingers trembling. The metal was ice cold. Slowly he twisted it. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. A heavy, suffocating kind of darkness. Shaq hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to back away, to run. But instead he reached for his phone, switching on the flashlight. A dim beam cut through the black void, illuminating a narrow staircase. The walls were unfinished, the air thick with dust and mildew. Then, a whisper. Shaq's breath hitched. He wasn't imagining it. Someone was definitely down there. His grip on the phone tightened as he stepped onto the first stair. It groaned beneath his weight. He took another step, then another. As he reached the bottom, the smell hit him. Sweat, rust, and something rotten. The flashlight's beam flickered over the room, and then he saw him. Langley, tied to a chair. His head slumped forward, his breathing shallow. "Langley?" Shaq whispered. No response. Shaq took a step closer, his stomach twisting. Langley's face was bruised, his lips split. The ropes around his wrists were tight, cutting into his skin. Who did this to him? Before Shaq could move, something flickered in the corner of his eye. A shadow. Then, click. The basement light flickered on. Shaq spun around, heart slamming into his ribs. A figure stood in the far corner, just beyond the reach of the light. Shaq's muscles coiled. Then a voice, low, steady. "You should have stayed out of this." Before Shaq could react, something cold pressed against his neck. A gun. The barrel pressed into his skin, firm and unyielding. Shaq clenched his jaw. His mind raced. He'd walked right into a trap. "Move," the voice ordered. Shaq lifted his hand slightly, taking slow, deliberate steps forward. His eyes flicked toward Langley. He was still unconscious, head lolled to the side. "Who are you?" Shaq demanded, keeping his voice even. The gun pressed harder. "The one cleaning up this mess." Shaq swallowed hard. Mess? He was in way deeper than he thought. The man's grip on the gun tightened. "Now, let's talk about what happens next." Shaq didn't flinch. The cold barrel of the gun pressed against his neck, but he forced himself to breathe, to think. He had to stay calm. The man behind him wasn't some random thug. His voice was controlled, his stance steady. This was a professional, someone who had done this before. "You should have walked away," the man murmured, voice low and gravelly. Shaq's hands lifted slightly. "Look, I don't know what this is about." "Don't," the man cut him off. "Don't play dumb. You wouldn't be here if you didn't already know too much." Shaq's jaw tightened. He wasn't about to let some creep with a gun intimidate him, but he needed to be smart. One wrong move and this guy wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger. "Okay," Shaq said carefully. "Then why don't you tell me what I know?" The man chuckled, stepping around Shaq into the dim basement light. Now Shaq could see him. Mid-40s, maybe older. Short-cropped hair, salt and pepper beard. A lean but muscular frame, dressed in tactical black. His eyes, sharp, calculating. This wasn't just some hired muscle. This guy was trained. Shaq glanced at Langley, still tied to the chair, barely conscious. His face was swollen, one eye completely shut. Someone had worked him over hard. The man followed Shaq's gaze. "Your friend here got himself into something messy. I had to clean it up." Shaq clenched his fists. "So you did this to him?" The man shrugged. "Not my first choice, but he found out something he wasn't supposed to." Shaq's stomach twisted. He knew Langley. The guy was a quiet, by-the-books kind of person. What could he possibly have uncovered that was worth this kind of response? "And let me guess," Shaq said slowly. "Now I've found out too." The man smirked. "You're a smart guy." Shaq took a slow step forward, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he walked to a nearby table, grabbing something from a duffel bag. A knife. Long. Serrated. Sharp. Shaq stiffened. "I'm the guy," the man said, testing the blade with his thumb, "who makes people disappear." The words were casual, but the meaning was clear. Shaq inhaled deeply. He'd been in fights before, but this was different. This wasn't a bar brawl or a court dispute. This was life or death. "Why?" Shaq asked, forcing his voice to stay level. "Why go this far? If Langley knew something, why not just let him go?" The man tilted his head, amused. "You think that's how this works?" He took a step closer. the knife glinting under the dim light. Loose ends are dangerous, and your friend here? He wasn't just curious. He was trying to expose something. Something bigger than you. Bigger than me. Shaq's eyes darted to Langley, then back to the man. Expose what? The man sighed, almost like he was disappointed. You asked too many questions. Shaq's mind raced. He needed information. He needed to stall. Look, if you wanted me dead, I'd already be dead. The man grinned. That's true. So why are we still talking? Shaq pressed. If you're so good at making people disappear, why haven't you done it yet? The man chuckled, pacing around him like a lion circling prey. Because I like to give people options. Shaq frowned. Options? The man crouched next to Langley, dragging the tip of the knife along the armrest of the chair. Langley groaned weakly but didn't wake up. You see, Shaq, the man continued, I don't kill for fun. I do it when it's necessary. And right now you have a choice. Shaq's muscles tensed. You can walk away. The man looked up at him, smirking. Forget everything you saw. Go back to your life. Pretend none of this ever happened. Shaq exhaled slowly. And if I don't? The man's smirk widened. Then we find out how much pain a man your size can take before he begs. Shaq clenched his jaw. The air felt thick, suffocating. He needed to think fast. The man twirled the knife between his fingers. So, Shaq, what's it gonna be? Shaq's breath was slow and controlled, but his mind raced. He stood frozen, muscles tense, as the man circled him like a predator playing with its meal. The weight of the situation pressed on him like a crushing force. His eyes flickered to Langley, who sat slumped in the chair, his face battered, his wrists bound tight. There was something different in Langley's expression now. Not just fear, but guilt. The man smirked. You really think Langley's the victim here? Shaq's jaw tightened. What are you talking about? The man clicked his tongue, shaking his head. You're looking at him like he's some innocent bystander. Some poor guy who got caught up in something bigger than himself. He leaned in, lowering his voice. But what if I told you? He's the reason we're here. Shaq's stomach twisted. He turned back to Langley, watching him carefully. Langley wouldn't meet his gaze. The man exhaled, almost amused. Wow, you really don't know, do you? Shaq's patience was razor thin. Then why don't you enlighten me? The man smiled, a slow, knowing grin. Your good neighbor isn't just some guy who got kidnapped. He was working for us. Shaq felt his blood run cold. What? Langley flinched at the accusation, his battered face tightening, but still he didn't speak. The man stepped back, hands in his pockets. He was part of something much bigger. You think this city runs itself? You think people just disappear for no reason? His tone was almost casual, like he was explaining a basic fact of life. Nah, there are people in charge. People who decide what gets covered up and who gets erased. Shaq turned fully to Langley now, his voice low. Is this true? Langley finally looked up, his eyes filled with something Shaq couldn't place. Shame, regret, or something worse. The man tilted his head, watching the silent exchange. See, Shaq, your buddy here? He wasn't kidnapped. He was silenced. Shaq took a step closer to Langley, fists clenched. Why? The man's smirk faded. His tone turned sharp, businesslike. Because he got greedy. Shaq's breath came slow and deep. Greedy how? The man chuckled, pacing again. Langley had a job, a simple one. He was supposed to make sure certain information never saw the light of day. He was good at it too. For years, he played his part. He moved money, made people disappear, kept everything neat and tidy. The man glanced at Langley. Until one day he decided he wanted a bigger slice of the pie. Langley let out a shaky breath. Shaq narrowed his eyes. You're saying he was working for people like you? The man grinned. Exactly. Shaq's pulse pounded. He had spent years living next to this man, believing he was just a quiet, friendly neighbor. Had it all been a lie? Then why is he tied up? Shaq asked. If he was one of you, why take him? The man let out a low chuckle. Because he got sloppy. He tried to take something that didn't belong to him. Something dangerous. He thought he could walk away with it. Shaq's gaze flickered back to Langley. What did you take? Langley swallowed hard, but didn't speak. The man sighed, pulling a knife from his belt and twirling it in his fingers. That's the thing about people like Langley. They always think they're smarter than they are. He shook his head. But in the end, we always catch up. Shaq's fists clenched. So what? You're here to kill him? The man raised an eyebrow. Oh, he's already dead. Maybe not yet, but it's just a matter of time. The question is, he grinned, what do we do about you? Shaq's stomach twisted. I wasn't involved in any of this. The man laughed. You think that matters? You're in the room now, Shaq. That makes you part of it. Langley finally spoke, his voice raw and broken. Don't listen to him. The man turned sharply. "Oh, now you want to talk?" He stalked toward Langley and grabbed his chin, forcing him to look up. "Tell him the truth, Langley. Tell him how you were ready to sell out anyone, him included, just to save your own skin." Shaq's entire body went rigid. "What?" The man grinned. "That's right. Your pal here? He wasn't just running from us. He was running with information. Information he was planning to trade." Shaq's breath felt heavier now. "Trade with who?" The man shrugged. "Does it matter?" He knew things, important things, and he thought he could make a deal. He looked back at Langley with a sneer. "But the problem is, Langley, nobody ever really leaves the business, do they?" Langley closed his eyes, his body sagging in the chair. Shaq stepped forward. If he was trying to leave, why not just let him go? The man turned back, amused. "Because, Shaq, the second he talks, people start asking questions. People start looking, and we don't like attention." Shaq inhaled sharply. He was in way deeper than he ever expected. The man smirked again. "Don't feel bad, though." He turned, walking back toward the duffel bag. "Langley would have sold you out, too." Shaq's stomach dropped. He turned to Langley, his voice low. "Is that true?" Langley hesitated. His lip trembled. Then, barely above a whisper, "I didn't have a choice." Shaq felt something inside him snap. The man let out a sharp laugh. "Told you." He reached into the duffel bag. "Now let's talk about what happens next." Shaq's breath slowed as he took a step back. The room felt smaller, the air thick with something unspoken. This wasn't just about Langley. This wasn't some random abduction, some unlucky guy getting caught up in the wrong crowd. No, this was bigger, much bigger. Langley had been part of something dangerous. And whatever it was, Shaq was now tangled in it too. The man in front of him, calm, collected, dangerous, smirked. "You still don't get it, do you?" Shaq's hands clenched into fists. His instincts screamed at him to stay in control, but his patience was razor thin. "Then why don't you explain it to me?" The man took a slow step forward, his boots barely making a sound on the cold concrete floor. Langley was useful, until he got too ambitious. Shaq turned to Langley, who was still slumped in the chair, bruised, and barely able to hold his head up. His breathing was uneven, like every breath took effort. Shaq's voice was low, steady. "What did you do, Langley?" Langley's swollen lips parted. His voice was weak, hoarse. "I tried to leave." A sharp laugh cut through the air. The man tilted his head, amusement flickering in his cold eyes. "You don't leave people like us, Langley." He crouched beside him, gripping Langley's chin roughly and forcing him to look up. "You disappear." Shaq felt something shift. The weight of the truth settled in his chest like a stone. Langley wasn't some innocent victim. He was part of something illegal, maybe even deadly. He hadn't been kidnapped. He had been silenced. Shaq inhaled deeply, his mind racing. "You work for the people Langley betrayed." The man didn't deny it. Instead, he let go of Langley's face and turned his attention back to Shaq. Betrayed is such a strong word. He stood up straight, adjusting his cuffs. "Let's just say Langley forgot his place." Langley let out a shaky breath. "I didn't know how deep it went." The man smirked. "And yet, you still thought you could walk away." Shaq exhaled sharply. "If he was so dangerous to you, why not just take him out quietly? Why put on this whole show?" The man grinned. "Because, Shaq, there's something poetic about making a man watch his own world collapse before he does." Shaq's stomach twisted. Then the man's smirk faded. His eyes darkened. "But Langley isn't my biggest problem anymore." Shaq's heartbeat quickened. The man took another slow step forward, and this time, Shaq felt it. The shift in the air. The moment when conversation turned to something else entirely. "I was sent here to clean up a mess." The man's voice was eerily calm, controlled. Langley was the mess. He reached into his coat pocket. Shaq's muscles tensed. The man pulled out a sleek black silenced pistol. He checked the chamber with the ease of someone who had done this too many times before. Then he pointed it at Shaq. "But now," the man said smoothly, "I'm afraid you've seen too much." The gun's safety clicks off. Shaq's eyes lock onto the barrel. He has seconds to act, or this is the end. Shaq's breath was steady, but his pulse was hammering in his ears. The barrel of the silenced pistol gleamed under the dim basement light, aimed directly at him. His muscles tensed, his mind racing. He had seconds, maybe less. The man holding the gun, calm and collected, didn't flinch. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, his expression unreadable. "This would have been much easier if you had just walked away." Shaq's fists clenched. He could see Langley, still slumped in the chair, barely holding on to consciousness. If this man fired, neither of them was walking out of here alive. Then, out of nowhere, Langley let out a guttural yell. With what little strength he had left, he threw himself forward, his chair tipping over and crashing into the man's legs. The gun fired. Shaq dodged, feeling the heat of the bullet as it whizzed past his ear, embedding itself into the wooden wall behind him. Without hesitation, Shaq lunged forward, tackling the man with all his weight. They hit the ground hard. The gun skidded across the floor, spinning out of reach. Shaq scrambled to grab it, but the man was fast. Too fast. Before Shaq could react, the man pulled out a knife. The glint of the blade flashed in the dim light as the man slashed forward. Shaq barely dodged in time, the knife slicing through the air inches from his face. Shaq swung his fist. A brutal right hook connected with the man's jaw, sending him stumbling backward. He crashed into the metal shelving unit, knocking over tools and supplies. Langley groaned in pain, his voice weak but urgent. "Shaq, you need to get out of here." Shaq wasn't leaving, not yet. He dived for the gun. His fingers grazed the handle, but before he could grip it, the man lunged again, tackling him from behind. They rolled across the cold basement floor, struggling for control. The man was strong, trained, but Shaq was bigger, heavier. He used his weight, slamming his elbow into the man's ribs. A grunt of pain, a moment of hesitation. That was all Shaq needed. He twisted free, grabbed the gun, and rolled onto his feet. In one smooth motion, he cocked it and aimed directly at the man. "Talk." Shaq's voice was steady, but the fury in his eyes was undeniable. "Who are you? What is this about?" The man wiped blood from his split lip and smirked. "Even if you kill me, it won't change anything." Shaq's grip on the gun tightened. "Try me." Before the man could respond, sirens. The blaring of approaching police vehicles filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed through the basement window. The man's expression shifted, just for a second. Annoyance, maybe even regret. Shaq took a step back, gun still aimed. He wasn't about to lower his guard. The basement door burst open. "Drop the weapon," a voice shouted. Multiple officers stormed in, guns drawn. Shaq immediately raised his hands, dropping the gun to the floor. "I'm not the bad guy here," he said quickly. The officers rushed in, pinning the man to the ground, cuffing him with swift efficiency. Langley, still barely conscious, was pulled up and escorted out. Shaq let out a slow breath as he watched the scene unfold. It was over. At least, that's what he wanted to believe. But something in his gut told him otherwise. As the officers led the man past him, their eyes met one last time. The man didn't look scared. He didn't look defeated. He smirked. "You have no idea what you've just stepped into," he murmured. Shaq narrowed his eyes. "We'll see about that." The officers dragged the man away. Langley was loaded into an ambulance. The chaos of the scene slowly settled. Shaq stepped outside, inhaling the cool night air, but his mind was still racing. Then, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. His heart skipped a beat. He hesitated, staring at the screen. Then, slowly, he answered. A familiar voice whispered on the other end. This was just the beginning. Shaq's grip tightened on the phone. His gut told him this wasn't over, not even close.